And so, while I absolutely believe in organizing for my own satisfaction in terms of feeling that I was seeing something all the way through, I went to law school to deepen my skills. And when I came out of law school, that's when I went to public advocacy, and I stayed there for 10 years. And it was an extraordinary place to be a lawyer, to be a public interest lawyer at Public Advocates in that time, because Public Advocates was working across the board. It was working on issues related to children, to the elderly, to consumers, to civil rights, with a lot of focus on access to jobs. But I will tell you, after 10 years, I felt that so much of what we were doing was taking problems that had to do with race and poverty and pushing them into the legal analysis that was available to us. And usually it was either there was a constitutional violation or there was race discrimination, both missing the poverty part of it altogether. And if you miss the poverty part of trying to deal with fairness and justice in America, you really aren't getting to the issue. And so I moved away from that and started the Urban Strategies Council. And when I started the Urban Strategies Council, the focus of it was to try to bring the kind of rigor that I had seen the Children's Defense Fund bring in Washington, D.C. around policy issues. The kind of rigor that I had seen the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities bring it to a local community, focus it on doing something about persistent urban poverty, but not to stop with the policy work, to help the community because of reach that we had to be able to have access from doing our reconnaissance about what's working, to help the community turn what's working into a policy initiative, and then become an advocate to make sure that the policies got put in place that actually helped Oakland, California do well. And we worked on infant mortality issues and access to early childhood and employment issues and youth development. And I will tell you, when I was running around the lake or at the grocery store, when I was running the Urban Strategies Council, I couldn't go anywhere where I didn't run into people that I was working with or people who knew about our work. That, I felt, was the most satisfying job I would ever have. The ability to be able to work in the way you want to work, but in the place where you love and live is extremely satisfying. And I remember when I went to the Rockefeller Foundation and met with the board, they were welcoming me and thinking about how excited it must be for me. And I don't know why I said this, I should have been more tactful, but I said, well, you know, I'm happy to be here, but I've had the best job you can ever have. And I told them about being at the Urban Strategies Council, and I said the reason I left to come here was because I absolutely felt that the way we were working in ways that were integrated, outside of silos, pulling together people from multiple disciplines to be able to have a common community vision about what happens, and understanding that nothing is going to be sustained if you are not in full partnership with residents and people who are living the issues that you're concerned about. And I think this needs to get to the national level and spread. And I spent my 3 years at the Rockefeller Foundation trying to do that until it became apparent that most of the policy groups I was trying to get to do community building policy didn't have the staffing or the rhythm or the walkabout or the orientation to lift up what works for what's happening on the ground. And that's what led to the founding of Policy Link. It wasn't that I just wanted to go out and start a new organization. It was I felt that policy needs to be done from the wisdom, voice, and experience of people who are working for change in their local communities. Local leaders are national leaders. They are solving the nation's problems. And until we can figure out how to help those leaders to be advocates for what they know needs to happen, we're never going to have the kind of authentic, sustainable policy that will help us move to new platforms, stand on those platforms as we continue to spiral up. And so I am pleased to be here at your convening. I'm loving the work that you're doing at transforming those of you who I've run into the audience, because it is just so important. And I believe, and many people who I work with believe this too, that we are at one of the most amazing moments that we will probably see in terms of getting it right in all ways. Because we are in a period of deep economic uncertainty, We are trying to come out of the Great Recession, and if you listen to the nightly news, they're trying to tell you a narrative about how we're out of it, but if you talk to anybody, they will tell you we are not out of it. We are still deep in a recession, in a time of uncertainty. And part of But the problem is that we have been dealing with is that we got into this mess because of a lot of smoke and mirrors, a housing bubble, credit fuel consumption, and the deregulation of our financial institutions. It created a sense of wealth, but it went only to a few. And most Americans lost. They lost their wealth, they lost their homes, they lost their jobs, they lost their safety net. And we haven't come out of that. We haven't come out of it, and we're not going to come out of it until we come up with a new economy. We need to come up with a new economy that actually one that is based on producing something, one that is based on much broader inclusion than we have. You know, you can take any poor country, and it's clear that what makes that country poor is not the absence of rich people. What makes it poor is that there are only rich people and poor people. There's no middle class. And in most instances, all instances of poor countries, you have vast numbers of people who are poor. The inequality that has emerged in this country is a huge threat to everything that people think of as being important in this country. But as we think about that, we also are in a period where our climate is in crisis. The climate change is a huge problem. And it is not a problem that's off in the distant future. It is right here, right now. Heat waves, they're happening all the time. And I would be amused if it weren't so sad. The way you turn on the news and you hear about the most extreme weather that you have ever heard of your lifetime, and nobody says anything about climate change. Nobody even mentions it. But clearly, the heat waves, the rising waters, and they're going to cause all kinds of death and destruction. Public health emergencies, security emergencies, one emergency after another. And sadly, the people who you care about most are going to be hit first and worst by the impacts of climate change, just as they have been hit first and worst by the impacts of the economy. That when you think about the economic downturn that we've been in, one of the things that's not so clear is how it has hit people who are poor, people who are trying to do the right thing the most. The African American community lost 50% of its combined wealth during this economic downturn, mostly from the foreclosure crisis. The Latino community lost 67%. That when we look at unemployment and think about the issues, what we often don't see is that when we report on the nightly news that unemployment has finally dipped below 8% to 7.6%, that it is still 13% in the African American community. And in many African American communities, you will find black men unemployed at levels above 50%. There are areas of New York City where black men between the ages of 16 and 34, I think it is, 50% unemployed. That when you think about health and obesity and those kinds of issues, we are seeing the impact of what it means to have been so neglectful for so long. So I know you thought I was going to bring good news, and I promise I will. But before we get to the good news, we have to face the crisis, because the good news is embedded in the crisis. Everything is falling apart. The climate is in crisis. The economy is in crisis. Democracy is really in crisis. And also during this period, something is happening that I think people knew was coming, but nobody thought it would come as fast as it did, and that is our rapidly shifting demographics. Today, 46.5% of all children in the United States are Black, Latino, Asian, Native American, of color. By the end of the decade, 2019, the majority of children under 18 will be of color. And we all know we're going to be at 2019 in any minute. It's going to be fast. By 2030, the majority of the workforce under 25 will be of color. Already, today, the majority of children born in this nation are of color. California is always ahead of the game. In California right now, 73% of all children under 18 are of color. 73%. Now, in California, 60% of those over 65 are white. And in the nation, as nearly 47% of children are of color, 80% of those over 65 are white. And that is something that Manuel Pastor and I refer to as the racial generation divide. And it's something worth thinking about because, sadly, what we see is where you have the greatest divide between those who are older and those who are young. You see the least investment in the next generation. Two places that have the greatest divide are Arizona and Nevada. And if you think about what's going on in those places in terms of underinvestment in education and other things, it's pretty clear where we are headed. But when we think about these shifting demographics, and we think about the fact that so many of the people who are going to be the future are being left behind, we recognize that the equity agenda that we have been pushing for so long in so many ways, pushed it as an organizer, pushed it as a civil rights lawyer, pushed it as a community builder, always felt that just and fair inclusion was the thing that you had to work on if you cared about the world, your country, your state, all of you. And I don't doubt that I'm sure every single person in this room has been working on justice in one way or another. And you were doing it because it was the right thing to do. You were doing it because it was the moral thing to do. You were doing it because it broke your heart to see people who you knew were as talented as you, as smart as you, not being able to realize their full potential because of barriers that were put up. And you couldn't enjoy your own success, your own good fortune, if you didn't feel that you were doing something to knock down those barriers. Those are good reasons to work on equity. When I use the term equity, what I'm talking about is just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate and prosper. The work of equity is to create the conditions that allow all to reach their full potential. In short, equity creates a path from hope to change. You can hope for something better, but you don't get to change unless you pull up your sleeves and ask, what's holding this person back? What's holding this community back? How do we think about what everybody needs to have and then back into what the solutions are that will allow people to get there? We've done it because it was the moral thing to do, and it continues to be that, but it's not just a moral imperative, it's an economic imperative. Equity is the economic imperative because equity is going to be the superior growth model for the future. Equity is going to be the superior sustainable model for the future. That all of the issues that we're concerned about, we'll deal with them if we get equity right. Let me tell you just a little bit about that. When you think about what we need as a nation in terms of really unleashing the innovation, to become the producers and the manufacturers and the creators that help to make this country great at a past time. It is the people of color who are being left behind, who are most hungry to engage in the entrepreneurial innovation that happens. Manuel Pastor, Stuart Crow, and I did a book twice, same name. The first was Searching for the Uncommon Common Ground, and the second was The Uncommon Common Ground. We said we found it, and so we were ready to present it by the time we did the second book. But one of the things that we pointed to in that book is that Asian, Latino, and African Americans start businesses at 3 times the rates of white people, and they grow faster. So when you think about what we need as a nation to be able to unleash that creativity, the people who are becoming the majority are anxious to be able to do that. But too often these businesses that I'm talking about, they may be starting more of them and they may be growing faster, but they're small businesses. Very often they're not about what's next, they're about what was. And we need to be able to link people to opportunities so that that spirit can go forward. Talked about the shifting demographics. Europe, Japan, they're very worried because their populations are getting very old and they don't have a lot of young people. The average age of, the median age of white people in America is 42. Of black people, it is 31. Of Latinos, it is 27. 27. America has a young population. People who have the energy, people who are still nesting and needing to educate and hungry to be able to get in there. And that's the kind of thing that really helps a nation to be productive. That we are a global economy. And with all of this diversity that I'm talking about, the United States of America is becoming a world nation. What could be more valuable in a global economy than being a world nation, where you have relatives and friends and you can connect all over the globe, where you are comfortable with language differences? The Latino community is doing some of the most exporting of goods outside of this country of any community inside the country because of those linkages. When we think about the value to business and the creation of business, this notion of diversity is clearly important. But when you hear businesses talk about the value of diversity, and they're doing it a lot now, and the Harvard Business Review, is that it? Business Journal, Harvard, you know it. They have had many articles recently talking about how diversity is good for business, but it is never diversity concentrated just in the mailroom. It is not diversity concentrated just in the entry-level jobs. It's not until diversity is spread across the company that the full benefits of it can be realized. And so while we have the makeup of a world nation, we don't have the benefit of a world nation until we can create pathways and ladders of opportunity to allow people to take advantage of everything that's here. So the very things that we need for the economy, we have the possibility because of the shifting demographics. When we think about climate change and what we really need to do to get people out of their cars and using public transportation, when we think about the emissions that come from buildings, which is a huge contributor to climate change, that what we need to do to fix that are exactly the things that low-income communities have been asking for all along. That the majority of the users of public transit are people of color, for many reasons, one of which is some more people of color are without cars. And when we think about how we are going to become a nation that uses a public transit system, we have to become a nation where we are comfortable sitting next to the other. Mm-hmm. Until we become comfortable sitting next to the other, we're not going to be that nation. And so the distance, the racial divides that we have always been struggling with as we have worked toward equity, it becomes very important in terms of being able to get the cultural change that we need around the climate. When we think about the older buildings that need to be retrofitted, they are often in the very communities that we have been urging reinvestment in for decades. And while it's still important for the people who live there that we do the reinvestment that we need, that we fix up these buildings, we do the retrofitting, we create places where people want to be, that'll be good for the people who've been left behind, and it'll be good for the climate, it'll be good for America. When you go to Europe and other places, Paris, I always enjoy going to Paris, but I will tell you there's a problem in Paris, and and I actually have to face it. If you've ever gone to Paris and you fly into the airport, rather than going into Paris, go the other direction. Go the other direction, it'll break your heart. Because what they have in Paris is a situation where all the poor people are out there away from the preciousness of the city. And the city, with its precious self, just sits there getting more and more expensive, more elite. We are at risk of becoming that place if we keep on going as we are going. For many years in my advocacy, I was an advocate to get people who were poor and low income access to suburban communities that were communities of opportunity. Well, as people have started to move back into cities, people with resources, people who are older, I have to say to my husband, if I'm going to retire someplace, it's going to be somewhere where there's a bus stop on the corner. It's going to be someplace where I can go to the theater and walk, someplace where I can get one of those nice little carts and go to the Whole Foods or wherever I want to go. I am not interested in retiring to some community far off where you can't do anything, and there are a whole lot of people who are with me on that. As the baby boomers think about how they want to be in their old age, they want to continue to be hip because that's how they define themselves. They are moving back to cities. Young people who have grown up in the suburbs, of course they want something different now. Who doesn't? You grow up one way, you want something else. They're moving to cities. And so we're finding that cities are becoming attractive, and that could be a good thing as cities get grocery stores and good schools and parks and cultural activities and all kinds of amenities. But it's not a good thing if the people who have suffered during the bad times get pushed out during the good times. We've got to focus on that. And if we get that right, the equity agenda, we begin to have communities that are dense. Communities where people are living together, jobs and recreation, all of those things concentrated. It's good for the people who might be left behind. It's good for the community. It's good for America. And so you can see that it's not just the economy where equity is a superior growth model. When you think about climate change, equity is a superior model there too. And so we're really in a very interesting place. It's exciting to think that the thing that we have worked on for so long is now here. But I want to just reflect a little bit about how we got here. That we really have to come to grips with the racism that has so defined the nation. That racism, slavery, all of that predated the founding of the nation. Racism predated the founding of the nation. It was founded under the cloud of racism. And we have come a long way from then till now, and the civil rights movement was extraordinary. The civil rights movement really was a movement in which lots of people across race and difference came together to say we need to break down these legal barriers. How can we feel good about living in a country where legally we have the kind of segregation and exclusion that we have? And through the extraordinary advocacy of many people, we broke down the legal barriers. What we didn't anticipate, I think, is that our development pattern would thwart every bit of progress we made in the courts. That we got equal access to schools, and good schools just got up and went to the suburbs, leaving poor people stuck in inner city communities. We got access to jobs in terms of equal opportunity, but the jobs got up and moved to the suburbs without any connection. We got access to housing and being able to buy housing and to be free from discrimination, but the houses went, the good houses, the houses that were close to opportunity, they moved away, leaving communities where there had been opportunity with none, as disinvestment just rolled across urban America. And so we went from having a fight around the law to then having to have a fight around something different. That we needed to confront the fact that we had become a nation in which where you live is a proxy for opportunity. Where you live determines whether or not you get to go to a good school, whether or not you live near a job, whether you live near a transit system that can connect you to a job, whether you live around people who form a natural job network, which is how most people get jobs. If I ask all of you, where'd you get your first job? Every story that you tell me will have something to do with some family member, some friend, somebody you met someplace that come over here, they're hiring. If you don't live around people who have jobs, it's hard to connect to a job. Where you live has become a proxy for opportunity in America. It even determines how long you live. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation did a study that showed there was a direct connection between zip code and longevity. Then in the Bay Area where we are, there's a 15-year life expectancy difference between people who live in the Berkeley Hills and people who live in the West Oakland Flatlands. Where you live determines how long you live, and it certainly determines how you live while you live. So we've gone from having to focus on the law to having to focus on transportation, to focus on affordable housing, to focus on zoning ordinances, and to focus on how we can begin to come up with strategies that put the equity agenda front and center. Now, a lot of people, when I talk about equity, particularly about, as I've talked about people of color, people who are not of color may wonder, well, what's going to happen to me when that agenda goes forward? And I think it is very important that we understand that the equity agenda is good for everybody. Good for everybody. And one of the things I like to tell to make that point is to talk about the cutouts in the sidewalks all across the nation. Those cutouts are there because of the advocacy of people with disabilities. People who had won the legal battle to have access to opportunity and public buildings and jobs, but the victory could not be realized if, as a practical matter, people could not maneuver around the places where they wanted to go. And so creating those cutouts, which allow people in wheelchairs to be able to have more real access, not just theoretical access to everything. Very important for the most vulnerable in that context of being able to move around the community. But how many of you have been pushing a baby stroller and been thrilled that you didn't have to pick up that contraption from sidewalk to sidewalk? How many of you, like me, have been pulling a suitcase and could just run for that train or that plane, just dragging that suitcase behind you without having to lift it because of the cutout in the sidewalks? How many workers have had their burden made easier because they could pull a wagon or push a cart without having to maneuver that? And how many people have had a peace of mind as their new bike riders were out trying out those wheels, traversing the community sidewalk to sidewalk rather than riding in the street? When you solve problems for people who are most vulnerable, you solve them for everybody. When you solve them for the elite, you solve them for the elite. I was talking about equity to an audience, and I have really been trying to discipline myself to include rural communities and people who are poor and white, because so often those issues are equally important. And so I gave this talk, and I spent some time talking about people who were white and living in poverty and living in rural areas, and I just talked about the issues. After my talk, a young woman in the audience came up to me with a tear coming down her face to thank me for recognizing her life. Because she said so often she goes to meetings and she hears about these problems and they're never put in the context of her life, even though her life often reflects these issues. The equity agenda is everybody's agenda. So as we're thinking about equity, we need to keep that in mind. And the transportation issues, I think, really get at it for us, because we all would benefit from public transportation. We all would benefit from the health benefits, both the health benefits that we get by using it and walking around, but the health benefits in terms of getting some of these cars off the street, the health benefits in terms of easily being able to access health services, the health benefits of being able to reduce the incidence of asthma and all of these other things. We would all benefit if we ask, how do we solve these problems for the most vulnerable among us, and then we get solutions that help all of us. Transform has been right there in terms of the work they've been doing in the Bay Area to make sure that we actually have a bus rapid transit system, and they have been advocates to not just say we need to have it, but to help to work out the details of how you make it work and where you put it. And they have come up with a plan that has really gotten attention as being a model plan for the benefits. It will attract 9,000 new daily passengers if you do what it is they say they want to do. Those kinds of issues really make a difference. When we think about transportation, I also think it's important not to just think about all of the health benefits, but in terms of building what we need, there are tremendous job opportunities. All those construction jobs, all those operator jobs. When you prioritize equity, when you ask, how do we get equity with everything we're doing, you have the opportunity for triple bottom line. You help the climate, you help the health, and you help the economy. You focus so that those jobs go to the people who need them. You really have to make sure that you do the local hire, that you have a pipeline in terms of doing the training. You're not just helping those who are being left behind, you're helping everybody. So it's mighty important that we learn from models like the Missouri model. Tens of billions of federal dollars are spent every year in transportation construction. In Missouri, the TEN, Transportation Equity Network, worked with other faith-based networks to make sure that they were able to broker an agreement in Missouri so that their transportation spending had 0.5% of the total set aside for job training. They made sure that there was a focus on the jobs at a very high percentage, I think it's 30%, went locally. And they have been able, through focusing on jobs, focusing on job training, making it a priority, The projects that they had the benefit agreement attached to were finished 24 days ahead of schedule and saved $11 million. It's good for equity, it's good for the economy, it's good for everybody. We need to just begin to own that. I wanted to take a moment and talk about what we have learned from focusing on equity, because we've been doing it a long time. When I say we, I certainly don't mean Policy Link, I mean Transform, I mean Policy Link, I mean Public Advocates, I mean Urban Habitat, I mean the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. The list goes on and on and on. We have such a strong infrastructure for equity these days, and we have so many projects that we can look to and say, what are we learning? There were a couple of things I want to lift up. Choose strategies that promote equity and economic prosperity simultaneously. So often, in the best of times, we say, well, we're going to do this project and it's going to be good for everybody. It's going to trickle down. Well, it never really does. And who wants to trickle anyway? We want to be able to have an avalanche of opportunity coming to everybody who needs it. So we have to do these things simultaneously. And there are great examples of that. Portland is part of his Emerald Cities collaborative. The Emerald Cities collaborative really trying to take all the resources that are coming for retrofitting and making sure that those dollars get concentrated in communities that need it, that the jobs get to the people who really need it. Well, they were able to negotiate something with their, in Portland, with the city council and with the mayor. They concentrated their efforts in disadvantaged communities. They established funds to support outreach. They have continuous oversight of the project, and they have ended up with having a $2 billion project with a primary focus on this is focused on water, actually, with a real focus on making sure that this project creates more equity in that community. They have one of the most ambitious community benefits agreements around, and I think Emerald Cities is demonstrating that in places everywhere. The other thing, though, that we have learned is that we have to target programs and investments to the people and places who are left behind. One of the classic examples of that is the work to ban the box. I mean, we know that in communities, Latino communities, African American communities, that so many people have been incarcerated unjustly in many ways for things that they shouldn't have been locked up for, but even those who actually did something that they needed to pay for, once they've paid and they're coming back to communities, they ought to have the opportunity to be contributing members of the community. And when every job requires you to disclose that you have been incarcerated, it shuts the door to opportunity. And there are so many jobs for which that is not important at all. And so there's a real movement around the country to ban having to check that box of being formally incarcerated, and to not ask those questions until you've looked at people's credentials, they get to an interview, not ask it all if it's not needed, but not ask it at a time that you shut the door unnecessarily. You want to target programs and investments to people and places that have been left behind. That when we're thinking about infrastructure investments, we need to say, where do we need that infrastructure? Broadband in rural communities, public transit in so many urban communities, public transit in regions that are rich with opportunity in the suburbs, absent in the inner city. One of the highest forms of equity is for every community to be a community of opportunity. But short of that, we need to have a public transit system that connects everybody to opportunity throughout the region. And so asking those questions about where we need it is very important, which takes me to the next one. Assess equity impacts at every stage. In King County, where Seattle is, they have developed an equity indicators report card that they do annually, so that they ask about all their spending, all their strategies. They grade themselves on how they're doing with transportation and public transit based on whether or not the people need it most are having access to it. They grade themselves on how they're doing in terms of employment, in terms of whether or not people who were formerly incarcerated actually have access. So we've got, and the last one, let me not forget the last one, ensure meaningful community participation, voice, and leadership. We have learned over and over and over again that if you're trying to get equity right, you have to have the participation of those who have the deepest knowledge about what's going on. President Obama has actually been quite amazing in the way that he has lifted up the need to invest in place. And a lot of the lessons that we are learning are actually getting realized in things like the Promised Neighborhoods program, the Choice program that's actually thinking about making sure that low-income housing is close to opportunity, the Sustainable Communities program that's actually looking at housing and transportation together. The Healthy Food Financing Initiative is taking the amazing example from Pennsylvania to get more fresh fruits and vegetables to low-income people. What they did was Governor Rendell in 2004 put $30 million into the economic stimulus package to get more grocery stores in underserved communities. To date, that $30 million has leveraged $190 million. 5,000 jobs, 450,000 people now having neighborhood access to fresh fruits and vegetables. PolicyLink, the Reinvestment Fund, the food trucks took this idea to the Obama administration when they first came in. And now we have a similar program coming out of the federal government called the Healthy Food Financing Initiative that has some $700 million on the streets. And much of it is tax credits, but some of it is grant money really helping to move forward. All of these programs are benefiting from these ideas of trying to achieve multiple things at once, revitalizing the economy with grocery stores, the same time that we're dealing with the health and the well-being of people who've been left behind. The equity agenda really is America's agenda, and we have had proof of it in California, proof that the whole nation could learn from. I am really so humbled when I think of this state and what it was able to do. After World War II, California looked around at its population and realized that most of the people who lived in California, majority of whom were white, were uneducated. Only 50% had a high school diploma. Not from California. 40% were from somewhere else. 25% lived below the poverty level. California looked around at that population, and under a Republican governor, Earl Warren, and a Democratic governor, Pat Brown, California rolled up its sleeves and developed the best educational system, K through university, the best health system, the best water system, systems of park, housing, bridges. It invested in its infrastructure, it invested in its people. California, by 1960, had a 25% economic advantage over the rest of the nation. And in 1962, Newsweek magazine had a big headline with California on the front, booming California, #1 state in the nation. That's an equity story. That is an equity story. Looking at